I'm gonna do things a little bit different. Um, I'll start off with like the usual PowerPoint, but it's only a few notes, and then I'm gonna go to a um, a screenshot of my browser because I have a bunch of verses up on there, and so it's not so much note by notes. But we're going to be talking about the Olivet Discourse, and for you, um, maybe you don't recognize the name Olivet Discourse, but it's really just the things that Jesus tells a handful of disciples while they're sitting on the Mount of Olives,
Mhm.
and so it gets its name from that. Um, and really, the scene is I kind of like this picture because it's you can see the temple in the background there, and they've just basically come back from out of the temple, and he's predicted to them that that whole temple is going to be destroyed, not one stone is going to be left on another, and then they ask him about well, when's this all going to happen and everything, and then he goes into the discourse. So the passages that we're going to be looking at are going to be found in Matthew 24, which is basically the entire chapter. And it actually goes into Matthew 25, and it goes much longer than just 24. It also, you have the parallel passage in Mark 13, where he covers it basically, it's just in that one chapter. Luke doesn't have this doesn't have the scene, that he doesn't specify that they're on the Mount of Olives, but he has the same general material in mostly in chapter 21. He also, there's a chunk of it that's in chapter 17, but that is so it Luke has that in a different setting than Matthew does. And I'll explain kind of probably why. So Matthew's version is the longest, and it contains some materials found in the other Gospels that are presented in settings other than the Sermon on the Mount. Actually, I'm gonna. There we go. So it's going to be on the. So what Matthew seems to do really is that he organizes relevant material into thematic packages. So he'll cover, say, like the Sermon on the Mount, and then add in other things that are related to that topic, that may in other gospels appear in other places. So it is actually very helpful the way that Matthew does it. It's not quite, he kind of uh, stretches where, like where those things are mentioned, but he'll continue on with passages that are not spoken of, like say on this Olivet Discourse. It's really you only find it in Luke 17. Mark 13 just doesn't have it, but he adds it in there because it's a related topic, and that way you kind of get the whole picture just in one good chunk. So he kind of lumps these things sometimes into packages, even if he's borrowing material from other parts of Christ's teachings. So what is the Olivet Discourse? Well, so the story is that um, for chapter after chapter, especially in Matthew, um, you see Jesus warning about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's laying into the teachers and he's laying into the scribes. He comes into Jerusalem and he rides a donkey, and while he's doing that, he laments over them and says, like woe to you, and if only you would have known the day of your visitation, but now your city's going to be left to you desolate. And he's saying things like this the whole time. So he enters the temple and he overthrows the table. He spends an entire chapter in Matthew 23, right before this, laying into the scribes. and Pharisees, and he just laments even more over Jerusalem and prophesying her desolation. So then he leaves the temple and he crossed the Kidron Valley and he sat on the Mount of Olives. And he told his disciple that the temple would be destroyed, And when they asked when these things would take place, he then proceeded with a number of prophecies that we know as the Olivet Discourse. Olivet is the name of the mount. So in one place, at least, it's called the mount called Olivet, or we know it probably better as the Mount of Olives. But it's the discourse that he tells four of his disciples on the Mount of Olives. So there is some symbolism from Ezekiel in that story that Matthew wants you to pick up on. So in Ezekiel 10 and 11, you see Ezekiel. Ezekiel sees God's presence leaving the temple. This is Jerusalem has just been idolatrous and unfaithful, and it's just gotten worse and worse, and it's just dragged on. And then finally, God has been warning them, Babylon's going to take you over. I'm going to send Babylon to take you over, and this is my judgment on Jerusalem. You're going into exile. And so so the Lord pronounces judgment on the leaders in the city, and the presence of God leaves eastward and rests on the Mount of Olives. In fact, it crosses the Kidron Valley as well, right? So the city and the temple would later be destroyed by the Babylonians. So that was kind of like the precursor. God's presence left eastward, sat on the Mount of Olives, and then went on to Babylon, basically. And later, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. So in Matthew 21 through 24, or I should say Matthew 24, actually that whole section there, Matthew 21, where he's going into the temple, we see the presence of God again, sort of the same scenario, but this time it's Jesus. The presence of God is there coming into the temple, and he starts pronouncing judgment on the leaders and the city. And then he leaves eastward and crosses the Kidron Valley, and he rests on the Mount of Olives. And the city and the temple would later be destroyed by the Romans. So you see the same kind of pattern there. Now, interestingly, if you go back to the Ezekiel passages where God leaves the temple, he does add some things about, that this temple, that he's going to call his people back, and that they're going to come back to Jerusalem, that he's going to restore a remnant of them and everything. Jesus actually doesn't do that. And he just doesn't say anything about the restoration of physical Jerusalem or the temple there. So it's a bit conspicuous the way that Matthew has it. But I'll kind of mention three basic approaches to this Olivet Discourse. One is futurist, and this is probably the way that you've heard it forever, unless you were in something. If you were raised in anything but an evangelical church or Pentecostal or a lot of Baptist churches, you would probably been taught that the Olivet Discourse is all about things that are going to happen in our future. So this interpretation is that the Olivet Discourse is about the end times. In other words, the second coming of Christ, the future Antichrist, the rapture, those kinds of things, right? Preterist, if you were Catholic or if you were Methodist, one of the older Protestants, or anybody before the 1830s, you would have either a preterist or a partial preterist interpretation of this, and an understanding of this. So this interpretation is that the Olivet Discourse is about the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem in AD 70. And this position holds that these prophecies, though they were future to the disciples, were fulfilled back then. So they're past now. They're not future to us. And then there's a partial preterist view, which is kind of like it takes parts of it that partial preterists believe that parts of this discourse center around AD 70, and other parts of it refer to events surrounding Jesus' second coming. I was just looking in this Orthodox Study Bible, which we had here on the table a little while ago, and it's partial preterist. A lot of people are partial preterists on this. So some of it being about AD 70, some of it being about Jesus' second coming. So the futurist, which is probably what you're used to hearing, the 70 weeks of Daniel is actually going to come up in this discussion in the next couple of weeks, because part of what Jesus talks about here is the abomination that causes desolation, right? For the futurist, the abomination that causes desolation is a future Antichrist coming into a future temple. And they get this from Daniel chapter 9. And the idea is that when you have the 70 weeks of Daniel, that the 70th week is cut off from the first 69 weeks. In other words, it's cut off right before Jesus's ministry. Then you have the church age, which is going to go, and then after the rapture of the church, then you have the 70th week of Daniel, which they call the 7-year tribulation. There's nothing actually in Daniel that says that it's a 7-year tribulation, but that's where they get it from. That's where they will say that's the 7-year tribulation is right there. There's no other part. There's actually no part in the Bible that says 7-year tribulation. You might have some references to 3.5 years of tribulation, but this is kind of like where they would define it, and I would have defined it 2 years ago as the Great Tribulation, being the second half of that. Then you have the second coming of Christ, and then going into into the millennium after that. So if you were talking about with a preterist view, then you would talk about the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 being fulfilled already. In other words, that there is no break between the first 69 weeks and the 70th week, that they're just sequential. And really what you're talking about, the 70th week of Daniel, is where Christ has his crucifixion right in the middle of it. The way this is interpreted is that he has a 3.5-year ministry before the cross, and that the Christ crucified puts an end to the sacrificial system. In other words, bringing the daily sacrifice and the grain offering to an end. It's not the Antichrist that brings an end to sacrifice. It's Jesus who brings an end to sacrifice, and he confirms a covenant with Israel for that 7 years. The reason I emphasize Israel is because Jesus's ministry was focused on Jerusalem to say, hey, this new covenant that I've been bringing you I'm confirming that it's true. In fact, it's me. And even after he dies, and I should say, and is after his ascension, the word goes out to Judea and Jerusalem that it's really not until the conversion of Paul that it goes out to the Gentiles, out to the Gentile world. So that's basically the focus of it. So this is actually a dispensationalist chart. Most people who are dispensationalists don't know what dispensationalism is. Probably more people who aren't dispensationalists know what dispensationalism is. I actually saw a meme about this week, and somebody said, you might be a dispensationalist if, and then they had responses, and one person, I think it was the author themselves, said, if you don't know what dispensationalism is. But you're probably familiar with this view and what it is. Like, say that this is the dispensation of the law, and like that you have, say, the 69 weeks of Daniel here in this area right here. that you have a Christian or a church age that is a parenthesis, and then you have a continuation for 7 more years of the age of the law and the 70th week of Daniel. The dispensationalism started by Charles Darby back in the 1830s. So you won't find this view from anybody until then. So, but what especially the early dispensationalists were saying was that the church age was something complete mystery and that it was never mentioned in the Old Testament. It's not known in the other ages, and it's called the Age of Grace. And it's based on the fact that because Israel rejected the Messiah when he came for them, that he went to a plan B, so to speak, and started a church age. And when that church age is done, that he's going to rapture them out and then go back to the age of the law for 7 more years. And you're going to have the last of the 70th week of Daniel take place. Then you have, at the end of that, you have another resurrection, and going into the millennial reign. Now, the millennial reign then is for God to fulfill his promises to Israel in Old Testament prophecies about the restoration of, so if you look here, Israel is supreme. Some dispensationalists will say that the Christians stay in heaven during this time. More modern dispensationalists will say we come back with Christ and rule with him, but they de-emphasize that it's for the Jews to rule the world, basically, So, and some other, so you've got several different views of it. Then you have the great white throne judgment at the end, which is another resurrection. And that resurrection is just the unrighteous that are resurrected. And then you have the lake of fire and the eternal state and those sorts of things. So really you have 3, and some dispensationalists say 4 resurrections. You have 1 resurrection at the rapture, 1 resurrection at the end of the Great Tribulation, another resurrection at the end of the millennium. And so, and then you've got different kinds of judgments. You have like the Bema Seat judgment, you have the Great White Throne judgment, you've got the judgment of the nations. So you have to separate out. It's actually kind of complicated, but this is generally like what's been, this is very popular in America. It's not so popular in Europe and the rest of the world, even though it did start in Europe. So if you're looking at, say, a millennialist timeline, and that's completely on the other end of the spectrum, you would say that this 70th week of Daniel is already completed, it's already happened, and that the church age goes on, and it's the same thing as the millennial reign. So what you end up with is that you have this present age is the millennium. And then you just have the second coming of Christ, where the righteous and the unrighteous are raised from the dead, and Jesus judges them all. And then you go into the new heavens and new earth, which probably sounds familiar to you if you've been with me for a while, because this is basically the way that I've been seeing things. I never called myself an amillennialist because I don't really understand all of the position. I don't know what who all calls them. So, and to me, it's a misnomer anyway, because I would say that we are in the millennium. Now, I've been kind of half and half on that way. Just because you do believe in a millennium does not make you dispensationalist, because that was a view that has been has come and gone through different groups within the church over the ages. But if you're like, say, in a Reformed church or something like that, that they're not going to believe. They're going to look at it as an amillennialist. So let me go to. So we'll look at the verses themselves. Where am I? I've got the relevant passages up here. And the one that you're probably most familiar with is in Matthew 24. It says, Jesus came out of the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly, I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Okay. A lot of people put this emphasis on the end of the age. But if you go to, say, Mark, right here, came out of the temple, one of his disciples came to him, says, look, teacher, what beautiful stones and what wonderful buildings. And Jesus said to him, do you see these great buildings? There will not be left there one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him privately. So now we know that it's 4 of them, right? Mm-hmm. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? And Jesus began to say to them, and then he goes on, right? If you look at Luke, it says, let's see here. Yeah, he foretells the destruction of the temple. Not one stone is going to be left on another. And they asked him, teacher, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? So they're not asking about anything except for the destruction of the temple. Because that's all he's been talking about. And it's basically what he's been preaching for a long time. When he was in Jerusalem, that's what he's been warning the city about. And the Pharisees and the scribes, he's been laying into them. And he's talking to destruction of this temple and this city and all this kind of stuff. So they're asking him about that. So in this context, there's no reason to think that he's actually going to talk about anything else. So let's go back to Mark 13 because, and kind of like look at this a little bit. And what we'll do is we'll kind of read it. I want to present like what the, kind of the different views on this. Okay, so we'll read it a number of different ways, and we're probably going to take a while in this. Okay, so this we'll just kind of get it going this week. But he says, so this is Jesus' response. Okay, tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? So we'll read it in a futurist way. Okay, and Jesus began to say to them, see that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. So there's going to, throughout history, you're going to have wars and you're going to have rumors of wars, but the second coming is not yet. And that's what we mean by the end, right? For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. We're going to have Israel and Hamas and Russia and, Vietnam and all kinds of wars, right? There will be earthquakes and in various places, earthquakes all the time that you see on the news. There will be famines, but these are but the beginning of birth pains. So the birth pains of the end of the world, basically, right? But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues. So if you would put this in the future, then you're thinking the Jews are going to beat a bunch of Christians in the synagogues or something like that. But probably most people will kind of like put their mind back on like everything that you read in Acts about how the disciples that are asking this question, the things that they went through were horrific. Every one of the ones that are mentioned was martyred except for John. They tried to kill John, or like church tradition has that they boil him in oil, but he wouldn't die.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, but then he ends up in exile on the Isle of Patmos. But Peter, he's hung upside down. Mark is killed early on and everything. And they were for sure beaten in synagogues. And you will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them. So here it looks like he's jumping back, right? And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all the nations. So now we're jumping back into the future, because the gospel wasn't preached to all the nations yet, if you look at it this way, right? So he's kind of jumped back for a sentence, talking about their time, telling them what they need to do, and then he goes on to talk about the far future. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you're going to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and the children will rise against parents and have them put to death. So in the end, you're going to have a lot of treachery and people who are influenced by the Antichrist, who do demonic things to get their Christian or believing relatives killed and stuff like that. And you will be hated for all men, by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Then it goes, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, so here we've jumped to Antichrist, right? Let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So if you're in Jerusalem when the Antichrist comes, get out of there. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. Let me get Aaron in here. Hello, Aaron. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that this will not happen in winter, for in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now and never will be. In other words, at the end there, Armageddon and the judgment there's going to be such a tribulation of things before the end that it's going to be worse than any other time in history. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says, look, here is the Christ, or look, here he is, do not believe him. For many false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. So there's going to be all kinds of false Christs in the last days. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heaven will be shaken. So probably not literal, some people would think, stars falling from heaven. I don't know where they'd be falling to, because any star is way bigger than the earth anyway. But anyway, the powers in heaven will be shaken, and they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. That's Jesus's second coming. Okay. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. And which to a lot of people sounds like the rapture. sending out his angels to gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Of course, if it is the rapture, then it is definitely after the tribulation, because it says after those days, after that tribulation, right? So I think a lot of the dispensationalists will say that this is actually the gathering of the tribulation saints, or if the old school of the dispensationalists would say it's the gathering of the tribulation saints who are Jews during the Great Tribulation, that are still alive, and the faithful Jews from the past taken from heaven, and now they're going to rule the world for 1,000 years with Christ on the earth. Newer tribulationists will probably say, well, this is the church is going to come back from heaven along with the tribulation saints, and then they will rule in the millennium. And then you have the lesson of the fig tree, and nobody knows the day and the hour, etc. You know, I'm not going to go into that right now. Here's the question. Where does he ever talk about the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem? And it's the same thing in all of these accounts. If you translate it that way, then what you have is them asking about when the destruction of the temple is going to be. And he tells them a little bit of information before the destruction of the temple. You're going to be brought before the Sanhedrin, and you're going to be beaten, and you're going to die for my name, some of you, and all that. And then at the second coming of Christ and the Antichrist and all these nations and wars and everything else, then all this other stuff is going to happen. And he just skips the whole thing, right? So if you take a futurist approach, Jesus never answers the question. And that's fine, but it just doesn't seem right to, to some people. If you take a futurist approach, you have to say that Jesus never answered their question and never gets into this destruction of the temple. So there is kind of another way to read it then, if he is talking about the destruction of the temple. So he sat on the Mount of the Olives, and they asked him when these things will be. And he says, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. So are there wars and rumors of wars between this time and 80, 70? Yeah, there's tons of wars, tons of uprisings. There's civil wars in Rome. There's a 18-month period where you have 4 emperors come and go because there's uprisings in Jerusalem. There's civil wars among the Jews. It's all kinds of stuff. This must take place, but the end is not yet. And what we're talking about is not the end of the world. We're talking about the end of the old covenant and the old covenant system. It's basically what we're talking about. And the end of the temple. That whole system's got to end, right? For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. So earthquakes. There were a ton of earthquakes in that time. There were, just in the few years coming up to that, there were earthquakes in Pompeii, in Judea, in that whole area. There were about 12 places that had earthquakes. Some of them had multiple earthquakes. So yeah, there were earthquakes in various places. Even just in the from 66 to 70 AD, there were I think 11 earthquakes in the region. There will be famines. There were severe famines, and one of them at least you can read about in Acts. There was a famine in the area, but there were a number of famines. These are but the beginning of birth pains. The birth of what? It's going to be the birth of the new covenant age, because it's going to be a process. The old covenant had to go, and the old temple had to go, and that whole system had to go. And it was a period of 40 years, which were turbulent and stressful, and a lot of things going on. So yeah, they were birth pains. And what the disciples, I think, saw themselves as being part of was birthing, being part of the birth of an era in where the Messiah would rule, and the gospel would go out to all nations. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to the councils, and you will be beaten in the synagogues, and you will stand before the governors and the kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. This is a very good description of what you see in Acts. Brother will deliver brother over to death, and father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. There were people in the Jewish community who were handing over their relatives to be put to death by the Romans. And even Paul talks about, there's another part here in Matthew talks about the love of many will grow cold. And we see that where Jesus is laying into the churches, some of the churches in Asia Minor, like the Ephesians and Laodiceans, saying that you've gone lukewarm, you've gotten cold, you've lost your first love, and that sort of thing. And Paul laments at one point that everybody in Asia had turned against him. That means that everybody, including the churches that were addressed by John in Asia Minor, had turned against Paul. So there was like a lot of falling away, and there was a lot of persecution of Christians, and those Christians, a lot of them were deserting, because when the pressure was put on them, they left and they turned on their brothers. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now here you get to the abomination of desolation, right? When you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, it says here, let the reader understand. It says the same thing here in Matthew 24. It says, let the reader understand. So you got to go back to Daniel and read that passage closely. And if you're able to do that at that time, then you can maybe start to make heads or tails about what's going on. And it says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, there is a parallel passage here in Luke, and Luke goes through the same things, but Luke is writing to Theophilus, who is a Roman Gentile. He doesn't have a background in Old Testament. If Luke had written to Theophilus, when you see the abomination of desolation, Theophilus probably wouldn't have known what he's talking about. So Luke takes the liberty of kind of paraphrasing it for a Gentile, right? He says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart. So the way that you could read this easily is to say that the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 is the abomination that causes desolation. Again, if you don't remove the 70th week of Daniel, which is from that Daniel 9 passage, and we'll actually get there. We'll actually take a closer look at that probably next week. Then what you see is that the desolation of Jerusalem would come within that time. So we'll go back to Mark 13. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back and take his cloak. And alas for women who were pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days being 80, 70, right? Pray that it may not happen in winter, for in those days there will be such tribulation as not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now and never will be. Now, that is hyperbole, according to the preterist view, okay? It's kind of like when Luke said that, Caesar Augustus decided that he was going to take a census and all the world had to register at their local home, their birthplaces or whatever it was. We know it's not all the world in a literal sense, but it's like the entire region, the entire, so, and if you were in Jerusalem at that time, for what it was, it'd be hard to argue that there's been anything worse than that, probably. It got so bad that there were so many people crucified that somebody described it to look like a forest, just a forest of crucified people. People were eating their children, it was awful, So the more you find out about AD 70, actually, the more that like some of this is going to, I think, a preterist view would be, you could see their point of view, okay? And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. So we're talking about false Christs in the time coming up to AD 70. And there were a rash of them. The reason that there were a rash of them was because of Daniel chapter 9. Because everybody knew that the abomination, that they knew not the abomination that causes desolation, just that, but all these predictions of the Messiah were coming to a head because Daniel was giving them numbers and times and everything, and they were calculating, and they said, we're in the Roman era. We're right when all this stuff should be happening. So that gave a lot of people the opportunity to deceive a bunch of people and be false Christs. There were a lot of false Christs in coming up to AD 70. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on your guard. I have told you all things beforehand. Now, here, I have looked at this commentaries on this section right here, or the equivalent in Matthew 24. And I think just about everybody, if not everybody from before 1830, in other words, before dispensationalism, points out that this abomination of desolation is the destruction of the temple in AD 70. In other words, this was the view of the church by and large for 1800 years. There's Eusebius, and I looked this up on the Church Fathers website, and where they have, there was, where is this from? He wrote a history of the church or something. He says here in verse 3, but the people of the church in Jerusalem, this says Eusebius, this is written in 325, around 325 AD. He's one of the church fathers, but he's also a historian. There's also Josephus, who's not a Christian at all, but here's Eusebius. But the people of the church in Jerusalem had been commanded by a revelation, vouchsafed and approved to approved men. The approved men, I think he means maybe the disciples that Jesus spoke to. There before the war, to leave the city and to dwell in a certain town of Perea called Pella. There's actually there was another prophecy during that time, which also told the people to get out of there. And when those that believed in Christ had come there from Jerusalem, then as if the royal city of the Jews and the whole land of Judea were entirely destitute of holy men, the judgment of God at length overtook those who had committed such outrages against Christ and his apostles and totally destroyed that generation of impious men. Here's that word generation. You know, this generation's not going to pass into all these things, and this generation's going to see this. But the number of calamities which everywhere fell upon the nation at that time, the extreme misfortunes to which the inhabitants of Judea were especially subjected, the thousands of men as well as women and children that perished by the sword, by famine, remember I told you about famines, by other forms of death, innumerable, all these things, as well as the many great sieges which were carried out against the cities of Judea, talking about rumors of wars and wars, and the excessive sufferings endured by those that fled to Jerusalem itself as to a city of perfect safety. There were some people who fled to Jerusalem. They ran into the city. The Christians got out. The Christians looked at the Olivet Discourse and knew to get out of there because Jesus had warned them about it. But the Jews, they were like, oh, let's go to the city so that we can run from the, and resist the Romans or whatever. So they ran to Jerusalem itself as to a perfect, as if it was a city of perfect safety. And finally, the general course of the whole world, as well as its particular occurrences in detail, and how at last the abomination of desolation proclaimed by the prophets, Daniel 9:27, stood in the very temple of God, so celebrated of old, the temple which was now awaiting its total and final destruction by fire. All these things that anyone that wishes may find accurately described in the history written by Josephus, who was a Pharisee. So there is a prevailing view. So maybe you've never heard it from anybody else, but just to know that I'm not making it up or that I'm off on a tangent somewhere. I know that probably I'm not going to convince many people. It's not, it took me a long time to be convinced of much of this. But I would encourage you to look at just commentaries, especially before 1830, about how the abomination of desolation and how these passages are translated or interpreted. Now, I want to address something here, and I'll close with this. In Matthew 24, it says here, tell us when these things will happen. And it does say, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Okay. Now, to be fair, Matthew is going to include something that is not in Mark 13, and it's not in Luke 21, but is in Luke 17, where it's basically talking about the thief in the night kind of stuff, and one taken and one left behind, that sort of thing, right? That is not in the other passages in this scenario. So you could say that is, some people will say that that's added on, and that's talking about the end of the age stuff, okay? The question you got to ask, though, is the end of what age? Because the disciples knew nothing about Jesus's, they didn't know he was going to leave. So when at the ascension in Acts, they had no idea that was going to happen. They're still trying to wrap their brain around the fact that he's going to die. They don't really know about the resurrection. They have to be convinced of that. If you're talking about the second coming of Jesus, they know absolutely zero about that. They can't be asking about that. They're clueless about that. So end of what age? Because when we hear the end of the age, we hear that what we hear in our ears is the end of our age that we're in right now. What they're asking about is the end of the age that they were in at that time. And it makes sense in terms of asking about the destruction of the temple, because they know that the new covenant is going to come. The old has to go. God is going to break off the branches that, and he's going to pour judgment out on Jerusalem, and he is going to hand the kingdom over from the present leaders and hand it to them. In fact, Jesus had gone and told, warned the Pharisees and the scribes and the elders and the priests, that the kingdom is going to be taken from you and given to another. And he's telling this in all kinds of parables. And at the same time, he's telling the 12, he says, you will sit on 12 thrones and rule the tribes of Israel. So what they're expecting is that kingdom is, they're following the Messiah who they believe is going to hand them the kingdom. And he did. And they are ruling the 12 tribes of Israel. It's just not the 12 tribes of Israel the way they thought it would turn out to be. And the way some people still don't want to see it. But that's what Jesus is talking about. So the end of the age is the end of the old order in their mind. So the sign of your coming, you know what? Let's do this. I'm going to go to, let's say, Isaiah. Isaiah 19. It's a good example of this. This is an oracle concerning Egypt. In other words, it sounds like I'm changing gears a little bit, but this is a prophecy about how Egypt was going to be defeated by the Assyrians, I think. So it says here, an oracle concerning Egypt, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. Now, when did God come to Egypt? Okay, what it's talking about is that judgment is coming to Egypt. Egypt's not going to see Yahweh. They're going to see armies coming to them, and judgment is going to be poured out on them, right? The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence. We know idols don't tremble, or, because they're made out of wood or whatever, But this is a symbolic imagery. The heart of the Egyptians will melt, and it goes on and on about how, in that day they're going to just 5 cities in the land. It just goes on and on. The Lord will strike Egypt, striking and healing. All that kind of stuff, So there are numerous passages, and we're going to take a look at some of them because I don't want to just back it up with one passage or anything. But when you're talking about the day of the Lord or the Lord coming, and he's coming with wrath, or coming on a cloud, right? That is war language. That means judgment is coming. And so when they are asking about your coming, they're thinking about the coming of Christ in wrath. Now, they might have even in their minds a picture of Jesus riding on a cloud and coming, to take vengeance or something like that. Now, remember when Jesus was talking, and it's really only 2 chapters from here. When they are going to, on the night of that they're going to, before they're going to crucify him, let's see, this says Jesus is mocked. Jesus before fire. Oh, so it's 26. This, they're trying to find ways to accuse Jesus. Jesus keeps silent. And then Caiaphas, the high priest, says, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said, You have said it yourself. In other words, yes, I am the Christ, the Son of God. Nevertheless, I tell you hereafter, in other words, after you crucify me, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. What he's telling Caiaphas is that when you crucify me, you're going to find evidence. You're going to see the evidence that I am ruling and that I'm coming in judgment. You're going to be part of this, the part of the people that are judged. He's relating the imagery also to Daniel 7, and we'll get a little bit more into that later too. So at least when we get to now, if you so just to kind of sum things up a little bit here, if you look at it, it kind of changes everything. If you take the 70th week of Daniel, and whether you separate it from all the other 69 weeks and say that is a coming of an Antichrist in the future, or if you say those things just happened all in a row and that the abomination that causes desolation is at the end of, and the 70 weeks are just all in a row, and they end in 80-70, or I should say 3.5 years after Christ's crucifixion. And then after that, you have the destruction of the temple. And so it's, but really, who changed what? Because we were all born during that time, at least here in the States, when dispensationalism became the predominant view of how to interpret of eschatology, and that way of looking at eschatology. Again, it's not a view that existed between 1830. And please vet me on this. Please, like, go back and see if you can find any evidence that find an eschatological timeline of dispensationalism, and then compare the scriptures that it mentions, and look at the notes of older Protestants, even older Baptists, older anybody, and see how they interpret these things. Now, when you do get to some of the parts later on about the stars falling out of the sky and that sort of thing, it's kind of split. Some people will say that's the future. Some people will say that is actually language around 80-70, and I'll explain that as well. So no matter what position you hold, I think you have a lot of explaining to do. So I will be doing a lot of explaining, but I feel like the reason that I wanted to bring this up a little bit more is, first of all, because I did go through Daniel, and since then I've realized a couple of things. The second reason is that because of what's been going on in Israel lately, you hear a ramping up of the talk, of end time prophecies, and people are talking about this is predicted here and this is predicted there. And when you go through those passages, it's just not there, or you have to take it out of context or something else, so I just wanted to let you know a little bit. It's kind of hard to see. It's hard to understand that there is another point of view if all you've ever heard is one thing. And then it's even weirder when you find out that it's really only in these last couple hundred years that it's even been a view, and that most of the world still doesn't think that way. Most of the Christian world still doesn't think that way. And just because there's a lot of talk right now about, like, this is this and this is this, and because Russia right now is at war, you have all these things about Gog and Magog and this and that and the other. And there has been so much in American culture about all of this stuff, and possibly none of it really makes sense. So anyway, I'm gonna stop while I'm ahead.